Hello and welcome to VVork. I'm Brian Watrous. This is the fourth in a 10-part video series in which I'm teaching you how to automate using VMware vRealize Orchestrator. In the previous video, video number 3, I showed you how to run an Orchestrator workflow. And in this video, we're going to be learning how to actually create your own workflow. As you can see, I'm already logged into the vRO client. If you don't know how to launch the vRO client, see video number 3 in this video series. But I'm logged into the vRO client, and what we're going to do is create our very first Orchestrator workflow. And as is traditional in computer programming, we're going to make our first workflow be like the traditional Hello World program that you've perhaps written in other programming languages. Now, the point of such a simple workflow is to keep it simple. Instead of starting off with an overly complex example requiring explanation of lots of little nitpicky details, what we're doing here is we're going to create a workflow that's simple enough that we can focus not so much on exactly how to do the programming, but rather the mechanics that you go through to create an Orchestrator workflow. So let's jump in. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do, and I strongly recommend that you do, is, well, we need to go into either Design or Run view because those have the Workflows tab. I'm going to choose Design view. That's the mode I'm usually in as a developer. And I'll click the Workflows tab. Then if you expand the inventory of workflow folders here, you'll notice there's one that already exists called Library. Now, conceivably, I could put my new workflow in there, but it's a very good idea, at least at the very beginning, to create your own folder and possibly subfolders to keep your workflows separate from the workflows that VMware is providing and the workflows that are being provided by third-party developers. So I'm going to right-click on this topmost entry and choose Add Folder. And again, I'll just create myself my own folder. And since I know that we're going to be creating lots of videos in this video series, I'm going to create a subfolder to keep them organized. So for instance, we're going to be creating several different variations of the Hello World workflow. So I'm going to add a subfolder called Hello World. And I'll put all my Hello World type workflows in there. Okay, so we now have a workflow folder. And to create a workflow, we're going to simply right-click on that folder, and this time we'll choose New Workflow. When you do so, a window pops up that asks you, what would you like to call this workflow? I'm going to call this workflow Hello World. That's simply the name of the workflow. It doesn't actually control what it does, but the name is meant to suggest what it does. Then I'll click the OK button. And let me go up top here and click on the General tab. I've actually already been working on something else previously. But as you can see, there's a number of different tabs up top here, including one labeled General. And that's where we're going to start in this workflow. In the General tab, there's a number of different fields that you can set, including the first field. The name of the workflow is, as you can see here, is exactly the same as the name I supplied just a few moments ago. Anytime I want to change the name of the workflow, you do that from the General tab. Next, we can see the ID of the workflow. For our purposes right now, that doesn't matter, but as you get more advanced with Orchestrator workflow development and using Orchestrator, at some point you might want to start calling those workflows from some external program instead of the vRO client. So one of the things that you can do with this ID is to use that to identify which workflow you want to call. But that's definitely beyond where we want to be in our Hello World workflow. In fact, we want to keep this simple, so I'm going to actually skip over quite a few other fields here and jump straight down here to this description field. Now, you're going to see description fields in lots of different places in Orchestrator, and you should always set descriptions. You can think of descriptions as kind of like being, they're sort of like comments within your workflow, like comments in a program, but these descriptions actually play a role that's even more important than comments in other programming languages. I'll explain later on as the video series progresses why these are so important, but just for the time being, trust me that they're important. So we need to type a description here that explains what this workflow does. So I'm going to simply type, this workflow says hello world. So nice simple description in this case. Obviously in real workflows I would probably have a more complex description. But the key thing here is I'm always typing a description. As you can see, there are other parts to the General tab, but for our purposes right now, we're done with the General tab. We're not going to go to the Inputs tab or the Outputs tab in this video because our workflow does not need input parameters or output parameters, but we are going to jump to this Schema tab. And let me zoom in on my workflow. That's what this drop-down does. And there's a number of these things called schema elements divided into different categories. Let me go back here to the generic category. As you can see, on the right side, we have something called the Workflow Schema. You can think of the Workflow Schema as it's kind of like a flow chart that explains to Orchestrator what you want the workflow to do and what order you want to do the things it's doing. Over here on the left side, you have what I call the schema palette, which, as we saw a few moments ago, has multiple sections. So there's more than just the generic section. There's all these different sections, but we're going to start in the generic section. And in here, as you can see, there are a number of schema tasks, including one called a scriptable task. Now, the point of a scriptable task is to allow us to enter code into our workflow. Now, many times when you create a workflow, you won't need a scriptable task and you won't need to write much, if any, code at all. But if you are writing code in a Orchestrator workflow, the language that you use the language that you use when writing code in your workflows is a language called JavaScript. I'll put some resources in the YouTube comments to point you to where you might go to learn more about JavaScript. The good news here is you don't need to know a whole lot about JavaScript. You just need to know the core basics. So for instance, you'll need to know about variables in JavaScript, if-then branching constructs, and while loops, and other types of looping constructs like for loops. So the basics of the JavaScript language is what you need to know. All right, so in this workflow, in order to say hello, I'm going to drag out a scriptable task. So I simply click on Scriptable Task, and I drag it out into my workflow and drop it on the blue arrow. And as you can see, the workflow expands. Now I've got two blue arrows. Those arrows are telling us what order Orchestrator should go visit these different schema elements. So our workflow is going to start with the start schema element. That's the green one over on the left. It'll then follow the first blue arrow to our scriptable task. It'll do whatever the scriptable task says to do. And then Orchestrator will follow the next blue arrow, taking us to the end schema element, and our workflow will be done. Whenever you drag out a schema element, whether it's a scriptable task or these others, you have the ability to change this label here. It's quite likely I'm going to have a whole bunch of scriptable tasks or other schema elements in my workflow. Having them all have their default labels isn't very useful. So let me change the label, which you can do by double-clicking and then just simply typing your new label. So I'm going to change my label to say hello. Now, after having done that, if I want to actually embed some code into this scriptable task, I need to edit that schema element, which I can do a variety of different ways. If I hover on the icon and click this pencil icon, I will be put into an editor that'll allow me to edit that schema element. Or as you can see in the tooltip that's popped up, if you select, by left-clicking, if you select a schema element and type Control-E, that too will pop up the same editing window. So I'm going to click on the pencil icon in this case. And as you can see, an editing window has popped up. And in that editing window, there are a number of different tabs. For our purposes here, we're going to go to the Info tab, and if we wanted to change that same label we just changed a moment ago, you can do the same thing here in the Info tab, but that label's fine. And again, we're going to keep things simple in this video, so I'm not going to explain these fields just yet, but we do once again see another description field, so I'm going to fill this one in. This schema element says hello world. Again, I'm not in this case typing a particularly descriptive description. In real-world workflows that are more complex, it would be useful to type a description here that explains what the schema element does, and if there's anything tricky about the schema element, this would be a good place to capture that, so that if somebody else is reading my workflow, or if I'm reading my workflow a few months later and don't remember how it works, the description will help me. All right, there's an in tab and an out tab and an exception tab and a visual binding tab, but we're going to skip those in this video and jump straight to the scripting tab. And as you might guess, the scripting tab is where we're going to enter the code, the JavaScript code that we're about to type. And we're going to do that over here in the right side. Just before I do, I'd like to point out that this thing over here on the left side is something called the API Explorer. We'll find out about the API Explorer later on in these videos. But for right now, we're just going to go type some code. I'll type the code and then I'll explain what I typed. Actually, I'll start by explaining I typed a typo there. Let me spell this correctly. So system.log parenthesis hello world exclamation point close quote close parenthesis semicolon. So that code there, again, is in JavaScript. JavaScript is a case-sensitive language, so notice that I've typed system with a capital S on the beginning of the word because JavaScript is case-sensitive, and in this particular case, JavaScript needs that particular letter capitalized. Now, right now, I don't want to go into super detail about exactly why I'm capitalizing that particular letter, but we will talk more about that later on during these videos. Just understand for the time being that if I tell you have to type a capital letter someplace, you have to type that capital letter. So what we have here is, for those of you who are familiar with object-oriented programming, I'll explain what's going on here in a little bit more detail. If you don't understand object-oriented programming already, just understand that this line is going to send a message that says hello world. Again, if you do understand object-oriented programming, system is an object that is automatically instantiated for you in every single workflow that you ever create. That object has a method here called the .log method, which I know is a method because of the parentheses. And in those parentheses, I'm passing in whatever parameters the method needs. In this case, what I'm passing in is a string, hello world. And then, okay, so enough of the object-oriented programming talk for right now. So everyone else listen in again. At the tail end of JavaScript statements, you'll find that JavaScript wants you to put a semicolon. That's why I have a semicolon at the end of the line there. Now, you may have noticed that I didn't say something like system.print or system.put a message on the screen or system.display. And the reason why that is because Orchestrator is headless. Now, what I mean by headless is if you've ever been into a data center, walked in, and you saw all those rack after rack after racks of servers, you may have noticed that there's no monitors in, or at least not very many monitors in data centers, because those servers are headless. A headless server is a server that doesn't have a monitor. And you need to think of Orchestrator the same way. There's no monitor to display messages on, but we can do things such as logging a message to a log file. Now, as you can see here, there's system.log. There are other methods such as system.debug and system.warning, along with some counterparts such as server.log and so forth. So you might be interested in seeing more about those later on, but for our purposes right now, system.log is all we need. It's going to log a message to the log files. All right, so a few little things here. You may have noticed as I was typing my code, For instance, as I was typing the string, the part in double quotes here, as I was typing, there's various color coding that's going on to let me know what's going on syntactically within my work, actually not my workflow, but rather my JavaScript code here. So for instance, notice that right now I haven't yet closed the double quote. Double quotes are supposed to come in pairs. I have my opening double quote, but I haven't closed the double quote. And to let me know that that's not good, that's an unterminated string, we have color-coded the code itself. There's a red underline. The string that's unterminated is in red. And down in the bottom left-hand corner of this editing window, it points out with an error message that what's going wrong here. We have an unterminated string. So I'm going to terminate the string with the closing quote and close the parenthesis and type that JavaScript statement ending semicolon once again. So as you can see, I now have my code. It's doing a system.log of hello world. Now I'm going to close this editing window. And just as a quick little aside here, I mentioned a few moments ago that there are other things that are like system.log. So there's system.log, system.warning, system.error, and so forth. You can actually type those like we did as code, JavaScript code in a scriptable task. Or if you want to, you can actually drag and drop these schema elements into your workflow. They will do the system.log or the system.warning for you, and you won't have to actually type the code. So we don't need that right now. I'm just going to go back to the generic section. And back looking at our schema here again, I'd like to take you up to this button labeled Validate. When you click the Validate button, what's going to happen is Orchestrator is going to validate our workflow, which is a fancy way of saying that it's going to check for problems that it can detect in our workflow. Now, this validator can catch lots and lots of mistakes that you might make in your workflow. However, it cannot detect every single error that you might have in your workflow. I don't know of any compiled programming language that does. So that's nothing unusual. I just want to make certain that you're aware that when you validate, there may be still some other errors that you won't be able to detect until runtime, when you run the workflow. But I'm going to go ahead and click on this Validate button. And as you can see, a window has popped up that's telling me the workflow is valid. It's telling me that multiple ways. It says so in text here, and this green bar down below tells me that the workflow is valid. If there had been a warning, those warnings show up in yellow. If there had been an error, those show up in red. A yellow warning is a message to you letting you know that that Orchestrator has detected there's something that doesn't look quite right in your workflow. But if you have a yellow warning, you can still run the workflow. It might work, it might not, but you can run the workflow. On the other hand, if you see a red error message, you have to fix that problem before you'll be able to run the workflow. Now, I don't have any problems in this workflow, but if I did, the messages that you see here will tell us in this first column what the problem is. In the second column, it'll tell you which, says owner here, but it's really which schema element has the problem. And then sometimes in the rightmost column, there will be a link that you can click on that when you click on it, tells Orchestrator to actually go fix the problem for you. Okay, so our workflow looks good. I'm going to click the Close button. And just like in the last video, this time again, I'm going to click on the Save and Close button to illustrate a point that we didn't really talk about before. Actually, now that I think about the last video, I don't think we've been in the editor, so you haven't clicked on Save and Close. So actually, this is the first time we've done it. So we're clicking on the Save and Close button, and you'll notice that when we do so, it asks us if we want to bump up that version number. I don't know if you recall this, but over on the General tab, in the beginning of this video, you saw a 3-digit version number that we can bump up. I'm going to go ahead and allow it to bump up that version number by clicking this button. Now, another thing just happened behind the scenes that you couldn't see, which is that when you click on that Save and Close button, By default, Orchestrator automatically does a validation as you do the save and close. Now, in the case like this, where there are no warnings or errors, the save and close validation is silent and you don't actually see that it's taking place. On the other hand, if we click save and close, the automatic validation takes place and there is a problem, it will let us know that there's a problem. Okay, so we have our workflow. We're back in the main screen. And as you can see, we have our workflow, which you know from the previous video, we can run multiple ways. I'm going to run this workflow by right-clicking the workflow. I'm going to click on Start Workflow, and the workflow starts running. When you run a workflow, as we said in the last video, you get a workflow token. So here's my workflow token. The workflow ran successfully. I can see that not just with the workflow token ID, I can also see that here in the General tab. It says that state is completed. Completed means it's done and it ran successfully. If you don't see this General tab, that's because Orchestrator at times will have minimized this section. In fact, sometimes it's minimized so much you can't even see the tabs. But notice that there's a resize handle here, which if you click it, drag it, and pull it upward, will let you see those 3 tabs. As we saw before, there's a variables tab that will show us any variables in our workflow. We didn't create any, so this is blank. And any exception messages, which are like error messages. Our workflow ran successfully, so we have no exception messages. What we do have that will be interesting to us is a tab labeled logs. So let's go there. If we go to logs, you'll notice that we can actually see the message that we wanted logged. Now, if you're thinking back to a few minutes ago in the video, you'll recall I was talking about how Orchestrator is headless, and I said that there's no way to print a message on the screen. That's true and not true. It's true that we can see a message here on the screen, but the reason why I want you to think about Orchestrator as being headless is that later on, as you get more and more sophisticated with the workflows that you write, instead of a human being running your workflow, like I'm running my workflow right now, it may not be a human being running your workflow. It could be another workflow running your workflow. It could be the workflow scheduler. It could be a completely external system like vRO or other things. So you can't count on there being anyone to see your message if you print it on the screen. So that's why we talk about Orchestrator as being headless, and that's why we use methods like system.log, which in addition to what we see here on the screen, system.log has truly written the message to our log files. All right, so there you have it. That's our very first workflow that we've written. Again, not super advanced, but as we go further and further in this series of videos, we're going to learn more and more things and learn to create more and more complicated workflows, starting with the next video. That's video number 4, where we're going to learn about variables in Orchestrator. So see you there.